Invitation to a Beheading, Vladimir Nabokov. Translated by Dmitry Nabokov in collaboration with the author. To Vera. Forward. The Russian original of this novel is entitled Приглашение на казнь. Notwithstanding the unpleasant duplication of the suffix, I would have suggested rendering it as invitation to an execution, but on the other hand, Приглашение на отсечение головы, invitation to a decapitation, was what I really would have said in my mother tongue, had I not been stopped by a similar stutter. I composed the Russian original exactly a quarter of a century ago in Berlin, some 15 years after escaping from the Bolshevist regime, and just before the Nazi regime reached its full volume of welcome. The question whether or not my seeing both in terms of one dull beastly farce had any effect on this book should concern the good reader as little as it does me. Приглашение на казнь came out serially in a Russian immigrant magazine, the Современные Записки, appearing in Paris and later in 1938 was published in that city by the Dom Knigi. Immigrant reviewers who were puzzled but liked it thought they distinguished in it a Kafkaesque strain, not knowing that I had no German, was completely ignorant of modern German literature, had not yet read any French or English translation of Kafka's works. No doubt there do exist certain stylistic links between this book and, say, my earlier stories, or later been sinister, but there are none between it and La Chateau, or The Trial. Spiritual affinities have no place in my concept of literary criticism, but if I did have to choose a kindred soul, it would certainly be that great artist rather than G.H. Orwell, or other popular purveyors of illustrated ideas and publicistic fiction. Incidentally, I could never understand why every book of mine invariably sends the reviewer scurrying in search of more or less celebrated names for the purpose of passionate comparison. During the last 3 decades they have hurled at me, to list but a few of these harmless missiles, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Joyce, Voltaire, Sade, Stendhal, Balzac, Byron, Bierbaum, Proust, Kleist, Makar, Marinsky, Mary McCarthy, Meredith, Cervantes, Charlie Chaplin, Baroness Murasaki, Pushkin, Ruskin, even Sebastian Knight. One author, however, has never been mentioned in this connection, the only author whom I most gratefully recognize as an influence upon me at the time of writing this book, namely the melancholy, extravagant, wise, witty, magical, and altogether delightful Pierre Deland, whom I invented. If some day I make a dictionary of definitions wanting single words to head them, a cherished entry will be to abridge, expand, or otherwise alter, or cause to be altered for the sake of belated improvement, one's own writings and translation. Generally speaking, the urge to do this grows in proportion to the length of time separating the model from the mimic. But when my son gave me to check the translation of this book, and when I, after many years, had to reread the Russian original, I found with relief that there was no devil of creative emendation for me to fight. My Russian idiom in 1935 had embodied a certain vision in precise terms that fitted it, and the only corrections which its transformation into English could profit by were routine ones, for the sake of that clarity, which in English seems to require less elaborate electric fixtures than in Russian. My son proved to be a marvelously congenial translator, and it was settled between us that fidelity to one's author comes first, no matter how bizarre the result. Vive la pedant! And down with the simpletons who think that all is well if the spirit is rendered, while the words go away by themselves on a naive and vulgar spree, in the suburbs of Moscow, for instance, and Shakespeare is again reduced to play the king's ghost. My favorite author, 1768-1849, once said of a novel, how utterly forgotten, Il a tout pour tous, il fait rire la femme, et frissonner la femme, il donne le homme, demande un vertige salutaire, et fait revivre ce qui ne revient jamais. Invitation to a beheading can claim nothing of the kind. It is a violin and a void. The worldling will deem it a trick. Old men will hurriedly turn from it to regional romances and the lives of public figures. No club woman will thrill. The evil-minded will perceive in little Emmy a sister of little Othita, and the disciples of the Viennese witch doctor will sing over it in the grotesque world of communal guilt and progressive education. But as the author of Discours sur les Hommes said in reference to another lamplight, I know, je connais a few quelques readers who will jump up, ruffling their hair. Oak Creek Canyon, Arizona, June 25, 1959. Invitation to a beheading. Comment vous c'est quoi de nous nous croyons mortels de la land? Discours sur les Hommes. 1. In accordance with the law, the death sentence was announced to Cincinnatus C in a whisper. All rose, exchanging smiles. The hoary judge put his mouth close to his ear, panted for a moment, made the announcement, and slowly moved away, as though ungluing himself. Thereupon Cincinnatus was taken back to the fortress. The road wound around its rocky base and disappeared under the gate like a snake in a crevice. He was calm, however. He had to be supported during the journey through the long corridor, since he planted his feet unsteadily, like a child who has just learned to walk, or as if he were about to fall through, like a man who has dreamt that he is walking on water only to have a sudden doubt. But is this possible? Rodoyan, the jailer, took a long time to unlock the door of Cincinnatus' cell. It was the wrong key, and there was the usual fuss. At last the door yielded. Inside, the lawyer was already waiting. He sat on the cot, shoulder-deep in thought, without his dress coat, which had been long forgotten on a chair in the courtroom. It was a hot day, a day that was blue all through. He jumped impatiently when the prisoner was brought in, but Cincinnatus was in no mood for talking, even if the alternative was solitude in his cell, with its peephole like a leak in a boat. He did not care, and asked to be left alone. They all bowed to him and left. So we are nearing the end, the right-hand, still untasted part of the novel, which during our delectable reading we would lightly feel mechanically testing whether there were still plenty left, that our fingers were always gladdened by the placid, faithful thickness, has suddenly, for no reason at all, become quite meager. A few minutes of quick reading, already downhill, and oh horrible, the heat of cherries, whose mass had seemed to us of such a ruddy and glossy black, had suddenly become discreet drupes. The one over there with the scar is a little rotten, and this one has shriveled and dried up around its stone, and the very last one is inevitably hard and unripe. Oh, horrible! Cincinnatus took off his silk jerkin, put on his dressing gown, and stamping his feet a little to stop the shivering, began walking around the cell. On the table glistened a clean sheet of paper, and distinctly outlined against the whiteness lay a beautifully sharpened pencil along the life of any man except Cincinnatus, with an ebony gleam to each of its 6 facets. An enlightened descendant of the index finger, Cincinnatus wrote, "In spite of everything, I am comparatively, after all, I had premonitions of this finale." Rodion was standing on the other side of the door, and peering with a skipper's stern attention through the peephole. Cincinnatus felt a chill on the back of his head. He crossed out what he had written and began shading gently. An embryonic embellishment appeared gradually and curled into a ram's horn. Oh, horrible! Rodion gazed through the blue porthole at the horizon, now rising, now falling. Who was becoming seasick? Cincinnatus. He broke out in a sweat. Everything grew dark, and he could feel the rootlet of every hair. Clock struck 4 or 5 times, with the vibrations and reverberations proper to a prison. Feet working, a spider, official friend of the jail, lowered itself on a thread from the ceiling. No one, however, knocked on the wall, since Cincinnatus was yet the sole prisoner in such an enormous fortress. Some time later, Rodion, the jailer, came in and offered to dance a waltz with him. Cincinnatus agreed. They began to whirl. The keys on Rodion's leather belt jangled. He smelled of sweat, tobacco, and garlic. He hummed, puffing into his red beard, and his rusty joints creaked. He was not what he used to be, alas. Now he was fat and short of breath. The dance carried them into the corridor. Cincinnatus was much smaller than his partner. Cincinnatus was light as a leaf. The wind of the waltz made the tips of the long but thin mustache flutter, and his big limpid eyes look askance, as is always the case with the timorous dancers. He was indeed very small for a full-grown man. Martha used to say that his shoes were too tight for her. At the bend in the corridor stood another guard, nameless, with a rifle, and wearing a dog-like mask with a gauze mouthpiece. They described a circle near him, and glided back into the cell. and now Cincinnatus regretted that the swoon's friendly embrace had been so brief. With banal dreariness, the clock struck again. Time was advancing in arithmetical progression. It was now 8. That ugly little window proved accessible to the sunset. A fiery parallelogram appeared on the side wall. The cell was filed to the ceiling with oils of twilight containing extraordinary pigments. This, one would wonder, is that some reckless colorist's painting there to the right of the door, or another window, an ornate one of a kind that already no longer exists? Actually, it was a parchment sheet hanging on the wall, with 2 columns of detailed rules for prisoners, the bent corner, the red letters of the heading, the vignettes, the ancient seal of the city, namely a furnace with wings, provided the necessary materials for the evening illumination. The cell's quota of furniture consisted of a table, a chair, and the cot. Dinner, those condemned to death were entitled to get the same meals as the wardens. Had already been standing and growing cold on its zinc tray for a long time. It grew quite dark. Suddenly the place was filled with golden, highly concentrated electric light. Cincinnatus lowered his feet from the cot. A bowling ball rolled through his head. Diagonally from nape to temple it paused and started back. Meanwhile the door opened and the prisoner director entered. He was dressed as always in a frock coat and held himself exquisitely straight, chest out, one hand in his bosom, the other behind his back. A perfectly toupee, black as pitch, and with a waxy parting, smoothly covered his head. His face, selected without love, with its thick, sallow cheeks and somewhat obsolete system of wrinkles, was enlivened in the sense by only two bulging eyes, moving his legs evenly in his columnar trousers. He strode from the wall to the table, almost to the cot, but in the space of his majestic solidity he calmly vanished, dissolving into the air. A minute later, however, the door opened once again, this time with familiar grating sound, and dressed as always in a frock coat, his chest out, in came the same person. Having learned from trustworthy sources that your fate has been sort of sealed, he began in a fruity bass, I have deemed it my duty, dear sir. Cincinnatus said, kind to you, very. This still had to be arranged. You are very kind, said an additional Cincinnatus, having cleared his throat. Mercy, exclaimed the director, unmindful of the tactlessness of that word. Mercy, think nothing. Duty, I always. But why, may I be so bold to ask, have you not touched your food? The director removed the cover and raised to his sensitive nose the bowl of the coagulated stew. He took a potato with 2 fingers and began to chew powerfully, already picking out with an eyebrow something or other dish. I do not know what better food you could want, he said with displeasure, and shooting out his cuffs sat down at the table so as to be more comfortable while eating the rice pudding. Cincinnatus said, I should like to know if it will be long now. Excellent, Sabayon. Should still like to know if it will be long now. Unfortunately, I myself do not know. I am always informed at the last moment. I have complained many times and can show you all the correspondence on the subject if you are interested. So may it be tomorrow morning? Asked Cincinnatus. If you are interested, said the director. Yes, downright delicious and most satisfying. That is what I will tell you. And now, pour la digestion, allow me to offer you a cigarette. Have no fear. At most, this is only for one before last, he added wittily. It is not out of curiosity that I ask, said Cincinnatus. It is true that cowards are always inquisitive, but I assure you, even if I cannot control my chills and so forth, that does not mean anything. A rider is not responsible for the shivering of his horse. I want to know why, for this reason, the compensation for a death sentence is knowledge of the exact hour when one is to die. A great luxury, but one that is well earned. However, I am being left in that ignorance which is tolerable only to those living at liberty, and furthermore, I have in my head many projects that were begun and interrupted at various times. I shall simply not pursue them if the time remaining before my execution is not sufficient for their orderly conclusion. This is why— Oh, will you please stop mumbling, the director said irritably. In the first place, it is against the rules, and in the second, I am telling you in plain Russian for the second time, I do not know. All I can tell you is that your fate-mate is expected to arrive any day now, and when he does arrive and has rested and got used to the surroundings, he will still have time to test the instrument if, of course, he has not brought his own, which is altogether likely. How's the tobacco? Not too strong? No, answered Cincinnatus, after looking absent-mindedly at his cigarette. Only it seems to me that according to the law, not you perhaps, but the administrator of the city is supposed to— We've had our chat, and that will do, said the director. Actually, I came here not to listen to complaints, but to— Blinking, he rummaged first in one pocket, then in another. Finally, from an inside breast pocket, he produced a sheet of ruled paper, obviously torn from a school notebook. "There is no ashtray here," he observed, gesturing with his cigarette. "Oh well, let us drown it in what's left of the rest of this sauce. So I would say the light is a bit harsh. Maybe if we— oh, never mind, it will have to do." He unfolded the paper, and without putting on his horn-rimmed glasses, holding them in front of his eyes, he began to read distinctly. "Prisoner, in this solemn hour, when all eyes— I think we had better stand," he interrupted himself with concern, and rose from his chair. Cincinnatus also rose. "Prisoner, in this solemn hour, when all the eyes are upon ye, and that thy judges are jubilant, and thou art preparing for those involuntary bodily movements that directly follow severance of head, I address to thee a parting word. It is my lot, and this I will never forget, to provide that sojourn in guile with all the multitude of comforts which the law allows. I shall therefore be glad to devote all possible attention to any expression of thy gratitude, preferably, however, in written form, and on one side of the sheet." "There," said the director, folding his glasses. "That will be all. I shall not keep you any longer. Let me know if you should need anything." He sat down at the table and began to write rapidly, thus indicating that the audience was over. Cincinnatus went out. On the corridor Waldos, the shadow of Rodion hunched over the shadow of the stool, which only a fringe of beard outlined in Rufus. Further on at the bend in the wall, the guard had taken off his uniform mask and was wiping his face with his sleeve. Cincinnatus started down the stairs. The stone steps were narrow and slippery, with the impalpable spiral of a ghostly railing. Upon reaching the bottom, he again went along corridors. A door with the sign "Office" in mirror-like inversion was wide open. Moonlight glistened on an inkwell, and a basket rustled and rattled furiously under the table. A mouse must have fallen into it. Cincinnatus, after passing many other doors, stumbled, hopped, and found himself in a small courtyard filled with various parts of dismantled moon. This night the password was silence, and the soldier at the gate responded with silence to Cincinnatus' silence, and let him pass. Likewise at all the other gates. Leaving behind the misty mass of the fortress, he began to slide down a steep, dewy bank of turf, reached a pale path between cliffs, twice, 3 times, crossed the bends of the main road, which, having finally shaken off the last shadow of the fortress, ran more straight and free, and a filigrane bridge across a dried-up rivulet brought Cincinnatus to the city. He climbed to the top of a steep incline, turned left on Garden Street, and sped past a shrubbery in grayish bloom. A lighted window flashed somewhere. Behind some fence a dog shook its chain, but did not bark. The breeze was doing all it could to cool the fugitive's bare neck. Now and then a wave of fragrance would come from the Tamara Gardens. How well he knew that public park, there where Marthe, when she was a bride, was frightened of the frogs and cockchafers, there where, whenever life seemed unbearable, one could roam, with a meal of chewed lilac bloom in one's mouth and firefly tears in one's eyes. That green turfy tamarack park, the languor of its ponds, the tum-tum-tum of a distant band. He turned on Matterfact Street, past the ruins of an ancient factory, the pride of the town, past whispering lindens, past the festive-looking white bungalows of telegraph employees, perpetually celebrating somebody's birth-date, and came out on Telegraph Street. From there a narrow lane went up a hill, and again the lindens began to murmur discreetly. 2 men, supposedly on a bench, were quietly conversing in the obscurity of a public garden. "I say, he's wrong," said one. The other replied intelligibly, and both gave a kind of sigh which blended naturally with the sough of the foliage. Cincinnatus ran out into a circular plaza where the moon stood watch over the familiar statue of a poet that looked like a snow-man. A cube for a head, legs stuck together, and after a few more pattering steps was on his own street. On the right, the moon cast dissimilar patterns of branches on the walls of similar houses, so that it was only by the expression of the shadows, by the interciliary bar between 2 windows, that Cincinnatus recognized his own house. Marthe's top-floor window was dark but open. The children must be sleeping on the hook-nosed balcony. There was a glimpse of something white there. Cincinnatus ran up the front steps, pushed open the door, and entered his lighted cell. He turned around, but already he was locked in. Oh, horrible! The pencil glistened on the table, the spider sat on the yellow wall. "Turn off the light!" shouted Cincinnatus. His observer through the peephole turned it off. Darkness and silence began to merge, but the clock interfered. It struck 11 times, thought for a moment, and struck once more, and Cincinnatus lay supine, gazing into the dark, where bright dots were scattering and gradually disappearing. Darkness and silence merged completely. It was then and only then that, as lying supine on a prison cot after midnight, after a horrible, I simply cannot tell you what a horrible day, that Cincinnatus clearly evaluated his situation. At first, against the background of the black velvet which lines at night the underside of the eyelids, Martha's face appeared as in a locket, her doll-like rosiness, her shiny forehead with its childlike convexity, her thin eyebrows slanting upward high above her round hazel eyes. She began to blink, turning her head, and there was a black velvet ribbon on her soft, creamy white neck, and the velvety quiet of her dress flared at the bottom, blending with the darkness. That is how he saw her among the audience when they led him up to the freshly painted defendant's bench, on which he did not dare sit, but stood beside it, and still he got emerald paint all over his hands, and the newspaper men greedily photographed the fingerprints he had left on the back of the bench. He could see their tense foreheads, he could see the gaudy pantaloons of the fops, and the hand mirrors and the iridescent scars of the women of fashion, but the faces were indistinct. Of all the spectators, he remembered only round-eyed Martha. The defense counsel and prosecutor, both wearing makeup and looking very much alike. The law required that they be uterine brothers, but such were not always available, and then makeup was used, spoke with virtuoso rapidity, the 5,000 words allotted to each. They spoke alternately, and the judge, following the rapid exchanges, would move his head right and left, and all the other heads followed suit. Only Martha, half-turned, sat motionless like an astonished child, her gaze fixed on Cincinnatus, standing next to the bright green bark bench. The defense counsel, an advocate of classic decapitation, won easily over the inventive prosecutor, and the judge summed up the case. Fragments of these speeches, in which the words translucence and opacity rose and burst like bubbles, now sounded in Cincinnatus's ears, and the rush of blood became applause, and Martha's locket-like face remained at his field of vision and faded only when the judge, who had moved so close on his large swarthy nose he could see the enlarged pores, one of which on the very extremity he had sprouted a lone but long hair, pronounced in a moist undertone, "With the gracious consent of the audience, you will be made to don the red top hat," a token phrase that the courts had evolved, whose true meaning was known to every schoolboy. "And yet I have been fashioned so painstakingly," thought Cincinnatus as he wept in the darkness. "The curvature of my spine has been calculated so well, so mysteriously. I feel tightly rolled up in my calves, so many miles that I could yet run in my lifetime. My head is so comfortable." The clock struck a half pertaining to some unknown hour. 2. The morning papers brought to him with a cup of tepid chocolate by Rodion, the local sheet, "Good morning, folks," and the more serious daily Voice of the Public teemed as always with colored photographs. In the first one he found the facade of his house, the children looking out from the balcony, his father-in-law looking out of the kitchen window, a photographer looking out of Martha's window. In the second one there was a familiar view from his window looking out onto the garden, showing the apple tree, the open gate, and the figure of the photographer shooting the facade. In addition he found 2 snapshots of himself depicting him in his meek youth. Cincinnatus was the son of an unknown transient and spent his childhood in a large institution beyond the Strop River. Only in his 20s did he casually meet twittering, tiny, still so young-looking Cecilia C., who had conceived him one night at the ponds when she was still in her teens. From his earliest years Cincinnatus, by some strange and happy chance, comprehending his danger, carefully managed to conceal a certain peculiarity. He was impervious to the rays of others, and therefore produced, when off his guard, a bizarre impression, as of a lone dark obstacle in the world of souls transparent to one another. He learned, however, to feign translucence, employing a complex system of optical illusions, as it were, but he had only to forget himself, to allow a momentary lapse of self-control in the manipulation of cunningly illuminated facets and angles, at which he turned his soul, and immediately there was alarm. In the midst of excitement of a game, his coevals would suddenly forsake him, as if they had sensed that his lucid gaze and the azure of his temples were but a crafty deception, and that actually Cincinnatus was opaque. Sometimes, in the midst of a sudden silence, the teacher, in chagrined perplexity, would gather up all the reserves of skin around his eyes, gaze at him for a long while, and finally say, "What is wrong with you, Cincinnatus?" Then Cincinnatus would take hold of himself, and clutching his own self to his breast, would remove that self to a safe place. In the course of time the safe places became ever fewer. The solicitous sunshine of a public concern penetrated everywhere, and the peephole of the door was placed in such a way that in the whole cell there was not a single point that the observer on the other side of the door could not pierce with his gaze. Therefore Cincinnatus did not crumple the motley newspapers, did not hurl them, as his double did, the gangrel that accompanies each of us, you, me, him, over there, doing what we would like to do at that very moment, but cannot. Cincinnatus very calmly laid the papers aside and finished his chocolate. The brown skim that had mantled the chocolate became shriveled scum on his lips. Then Cincinnatus put on the black dressing gown, which was too long for him, the black slippers with pompons, the black skull cap, and began walking about the cell as he had done every morning since the first day of his confinement, childhood on suburban lawns. They played ball, pig, daddy longlegs, leapfrog, rumpberry, poke. He was light and nimble, but they did not like to play with him. In winter the city slopes were covered with a smooth sheet of snow, and what fun it was to hurtle down on the so-called glassy Suburov sleds. How quickly night would fall when one was going home after sledding, what stars, what thought and sadness up above, and what ignorance below. In the frosty metallic dark, the edible windows glowed with amber and crimson light. Women on fox furs over silk dresses ran across the street from house to house. The electric wagonette stirred up a momentary luminescent blizzard as it sped by over a snow-powdered track. A small voice, Arkady Ilyich, take a look at Cincinnatus. He was not angry at the informers, but the latter multiplied, and as I matured became frightening. Cincinnatus, who seemed pitch black to them, as though he had been cut off of an cord-sized block of night, opaque Cincinnatus, would turn this way and that, trying to catch the rays, trying with desperate haste to stand in such a way as to seem translucent. Those around him understood each other at the first word, since they had no words that would end in an unexpected way, perhaps in some archaic letter, an upsilamba, becoming a bird or a catapult with so wondrous consequences. In the dusty little museum of Second Boulevard, where they used to take him as a child, and where he himself would later take his charges, there was a collection of rare, marvelous objects, but all the townsmen, except Cincinnatus, found them just as limited and transparent as they did each other. That which does not have a name does not exist. Unfortunately, everything had a name. Nameless existence, intangible substance, Cincinnatus read on the wall where the door covered it when open. Perpetual name-day celebrants, you can just, was written in another place. Further to the left, in a strong and neat hand, without a single superfluous line, note that when they address you, the continuation had been erased. Next to this, in clumsy childish letters, I will collect fines from writers, signed Director of the Prison. One could make out yet another line, an ancient and enigmatic one. Measure me while I live, after it will be too late. In any case, I have been measured, said Cincinnatus, resuming his journey and rapping lightly with his knuckles on the walls. But how I don't want to die. My soul has burrowed under the pillow. Oh, I don't want to. It will be cold getting out of my warm body, but I don't want to. Wait a while, let me doze some more. 12, 13, 14. At 15, Cincinnatus went to work in a toy shop, where he was assigned by reason of his small stature. In the evenings he would feast on ancient books to the lazy, enchanting lap of wavelets in the floating library. In memoriam of Dr. Sinikov, who had drowned at just that spot in the city river. The grinding of chains, the little gallery, with its orange-colored lamp shades, the plash, the Walter's smooth surface oiled by the moon, and in the distance, lights flickering past the dark web of a lofty bridge. Later, however, the valuable volumes began to suffer from the damp, so that in the end it was necessary to drain the river, channeling all the water over to the Strop by means of a specially dug canal. In the shop he struggled for a long time with the intricate trifles and worked on rag dolls for schoolgirls. Here there was a little hairy Pushkin in a fur carrick, and a rat-like Gogol in a flamboyant waistcoat, and a little Tolstoy with his flat nose in a peasant smock, and many others, as for example Dobrolyubov in spectacles without lenses and all buttoned up. Having artificially developed a fondness for the mythical 19th century, Cincinnatus was ready to become completely engrossed in the midst of that antiquity and find therein a false shelter, but something else distracted him. There in that little factory worked Marthe, her moist lips half open, aiming a thread at the eye of a needle. Hi, Cincinnatus! And so began those rapturous wanderings, in the very, very spacious, so much so that even the hills in the distance would be hazy from the ecstasy of their remoteness, to Mara gardens where for no reason the willows weep into 3 brooks, and the brooks and 3 cascades, and each with its own small rainbow, tumble into the lake where the swan floats arm in arm with its reflection. The level lawns, the rhododendrons, the oak groves, the merry gardeners in their green jackboots playing hide-and-seek the whole day through, some grotto, some idyllic bench on which three jokers have left three neat little heaps. It's a trick. They are imitations made of brown painted of tin. Some baby deer bounding into the avenue, and before your very eyes turning into trembling models of sunlight. That is what those gardens were like. There is Martha's lisping prattle, her white stockings and velvet slippers, her cool breast and rosy kisses tasting of wild strawberries. If only one could see from here. At least the treetops, at least the distant range of hills. Cincinnatus tried the dressing gown a bit tighter. Cincinnatus moved the table and began dragging it backwards, as it shrieked with rage. How unwillingly! With what shudderings it moved across the stone floor! Its shudderings were transmitted to Cincinnatus's fingers and to Cincinnatus's palate as he retreated toward the window, that is, toward the wall where, the way up high, there was an inclined cavity of the window. A loud spoon fell, the cup began to dance, the pencil started to roll, one book began sliding upon another. Cincinnatus lifted the bucking chair onto the table. Finally he climbed up himself, but of course he could see nothing, only the hot sky, with a few white hairs thinly combed back, the remnants of the clouds that could not tolerate the blueness. Cincinnatus could barely stretch as far as the bars beyond which rose the window tunnel, with more bars at the end, and their shadowed repetition on the peeling walls of their stone incline. There, on one side, written in the same neat, contemptuous hand as one of the half-erased sentences he had read before, was the inscription, "You cannot see anything I tried it to." Cincinnatus was standing on tiptoe, holding the iron bars with his small hands, which were all white from the strain, and half of his face was covered with the sunny grating, and the gold of his left mustache shone, and there was a tiny golden cage in each of his mirror-like pupils, while below, from behind, his heels rose out of the two large slippers. "A little more and you'll have a fall," said Rodion, who had been standing nearby for a full half-minute, and now firmly clenched the leg of the trembling chair. It's all right, you can climb down now." Rodion had cornflower blue eyes, and as always, his splendid red beard. This attractive Russian countenance was turned upwards towards Cincinnatus, who stepped on it with his naked soul. That is, his double stepped on it, while Cincinnatus himself had already descended from the chair to the table. Rodion embraced him like a baby, carefully took him down, after which he moved the table with a violin-like sound to its previous place and sat on the edge, dangling the foot that was in the air, bracing the other against the floor, having assumed the imitation jaunty pose of operatic rakes in the tavern scene, while Cincinnatus picked at the sash of his dressing gown and did his best not to cry. Rodion was singing in his bass baritone, rolling his eyes, brandishing the empty mug. Martha used to sing that same dashing song once. Tears gushed from the eyes of Cincinnatus. On a climactic note, Rodion sent the mug crashing against the floor and slid off the table. His song went on in chorus, even though he was alone. Suddenly he raised both arms and went out. Sitting on the floor, Cincinnatus looked upward through his tears. The shadow of the bars had already moved. He tried for the 100th time to move the table, but alas, the legs had been bolted down for ages. He ate a pressed fig and began again to walk about the cell. 19, 20, 21. At 22, he was transferred to a kindergarten as a teacher in Division F, and at that time he married Martha. Almost immediately after, he had assumed his new duties, consisting of keeping busy little children who were lame, hunchbacked, or cross-eyed. An important personage made a second-degree complaint against him. Cautiously, in the form of a conjecture, there was expressed the suggestion of Cincinnatus's basic illegality. Together with this memorandum, the city's fathers also examined the old complaints that had been made from time to time by more perceptive of his colleagues at the workshop. The chairman of the education committee and certain other official figures took turns locking themselves up with him and making on him the tests prescribed by law. For several days in a row he was not allowed to sleep and was compelled to keep up a rapid, senseless small talk until it bordered on delirium, to write letters to various objects and natural phenomena, enact everyday scenes, and to imitate various animals, trades, and maladies. All of this he performed, all of this he passed, because he was young, resourceful, fresh, yearning to live, and live for a while with Martha. Reluctantly they released him, allowing him to continue working with children of the lowest category who were expendable in order to see what would come of it. He took them for walks in pairs while he turned the handle of a small portable music box that looked like a coffee grinder. On holidays he would swing with them at the playground. The whole cluster would be still and breathless as it soared and would squeal as it plummeted down. Some of them he taught to read. Meanwhile, Martha began deceiving him during the very first year of their marriage, anywhere and with anybody. Generally, when Cincinnatus came home, she would have a certain sated half-smile on her face as she pressed her plump chin against her neck, as if reproaching herself, and gazing up with her honest hazel eyes, would say in a soft cooing voice, "Little Marthe did it again today." He would look at her for a few seconds, pressing his palm to his cheek like a woman, and then, whining soundlessly, would go off through all the rooms full of their relatives, and lock himself in the bathroom, where he would stamp his feet, let the water run, and cough so as to cover up the sound of his weeping. Sometimes, to justify herself, she would explain to him, "You know what kind of creature I am. It's such a small thing, it's such a relief to a man." Soon she became pregnant, and not by him. She bore a boy, immediately got pregnant again not by him, and bore a girl. The boy was lame and evil-tempered, the girl dull, obese, and nearly blind. Because of their defects, both children ended up in his kindergarten, and it was odd to see nimble, sleek, rosy Marthe leading home this cripple and this stocky trot. Gradually, Cincinnatus stopped watching himself altogether, and one day, at some open meeting in the city park where there was a sudden wave of alarm, and someone said in a loud voice, "Citizens, there is among us a—" Here followed a strange, almost forgotten word, and the wind swished through the locust trees, and Cincinnatus found nothing better than to get up and walk away, absent-mindedly picking up leaves from bushes bordering the path, and 10 days later he was arrested. "Tomorrow, probably," said Cincinnatus, as he slowly walked about the cell. "Tomorrow, probably," said Cincinnatus, and sat down on the cot, kneading his forehead with the palm of his hand. A sunset ray was repeating effects that were already familiar. "Tomorrow, probably," said Cincinnatus with a sigh. It was too quiet today, so tomorrow, bright and early. For a while they were all silent. The earthenware pitcher with water at the bottom that had offered to drink all the prisoners of the world, the walls, their arms around each other's shoulders like a foursome discussing a square, secret, inaudible whispers, the velvet spider somehow resembling Marthe, the large black books on the table. "What a misunderstanding," said Cincinnatus, and suddenly burst out laughing. He stood up and took off the dressing gown, the skull-cap, the slippers. He took off the linen trousers and shirt. He took off his head like a toupee, took off his collarbones like shoulder-straps, took off his rib-cage like a hauberk. He took off his hips and his legs. He took off his arms like gauntlets and threw them in a corner. What was left of him gradually dissolved, hardly coloring the air. At first Cincinnatus simply reveled in the coolness. Then, fully immersed in his secret medium, he began freely and happily to— The iron thunderclap of the bolt resounded, and Cincinnatus instantly grew all that he had cast off, the skull-cap included. Rodion the jailer brought a dozen yellow plums in a round basket lined with grape leaves, a present from the director's wife. "Cincinnatus, your criminal exercise has refreshed you." 3. Cincinnatus was awakened by the doom-like din of voices mounting in the corridor. Even though the day before he had prepared for such an awakening, still he could not cope with this breathing and the beating of his heart. Folding the dressing-gown over his heart so that it would not see, "Be quiet, it is nothing," as one says to a child at the moment of an incredible disaster. Covering his heart and raising himself slightly, Cincinnatus listened. There was the shuffling of many feet at various levels of audibility. There were the voices, also at various depths. One surged up with a question. Another, closer, responded. Hastening from afar, someone whizzed by and started to slide over the stone as over ice. In the midst of the hubbub, the director's bass uttered several words, indistinct but definitely imperative. The most frightening thing was that all this bustle was perceived by a child's voice. The director had a small daughter. Cincinnatus distinguished both the whining terror of his lawyer and the muttering of Rodion. And again somebody on the run asked a booming question. Somebody boomingly answered. A huffing, a crackling, a clattering, as if someone were probing with a stick under a bench. "Couldn't find it?" the director inquired distinctly. Footsteps ran past, ran past, and returned. Cincinnatus could not bear it any longer. He lowered his feet to the floor. They had not let him see Marthe, after all. Should I begin dressing, or will they come to costume me? "Oh, have I done with it? Come in." However, they tortured him for another 2 minutes or so. Suddenly the door opened, and gliding, his lawyer rushed in. He was ruffled and sweaty. He was fiddling with his left cuff, and his eyes were wandering around. "I lost a cuff-link," he exclaimed, panting rapidly like a dog. "Must have rushed against some when I was with sweet little Emmy. She's always so full of mischief. By the coat-tails every time I drop in, and the point is that I heard something, but I didn't pay any. Look, the chain must have— I was very fond of— well, it's too late now. Maybe I can still— I promised all the guards— It's a pity, though. A foolish, sleepy error," said Cincinnatus quietly. "I misinterpreted the fuss. This sort of thing is not good for the heart. Oh, thanks, don't worry about it. It's nothing." Absent-mindedly muttered the lawyer, and with his eyes he literally scoured the corners of the cell. It was plain that he was upset by the loss of that precious object. It was plain. The loss of the object upset him. The object was precious. He was upset by the loss of the object. With a soft groan, Cincinnatus went back to bed. The other sat down at the foot of the cot. "As I was coming to see you," said the lawyer. "I was so spry and cheerful, but now this trifle has distressed me, for, after all, it was a trifle, you'll agree. There are more important things. Well, how are you feeling?" "In the mood for a confidential chat," replied Cincinnatus with eyes closed. "I want to share with you some conclusions I have reached. I am surrounded by some sort of wretched spectres, not by people. They torment me as can torment only senseless visions, bad dreams, dregs of delirium, the drivel of nightmares, and everything that passes down here for real life. In theory, one would wish to wake up, but wake up I cannot without outside help, and yet I fear this help terribly, and my very soul is grown lazy and accustomed to its snug, swaddling clothes. Of all the spectres that surround me, you, Roman Vissarionovich, are probably the most wretched, but on the other hand, in view of your logical position and our invented habitus, you are, in a manner of speaking, an adviser, a defender." "At your service," said the lawyer, glad that Cincinnatus had at last become talkative. "So this is what I want to ask you. On what grounds do they refuse to tell me the exact execution date?" "Wait a minute, I am not finished yet. The so-called director avoids a straight answer and refers to the fact that, wait a minute, I want to know in the first place who is the authority to appoint the day. I want to know, in the second place, how to get some sense of the institution, or individual, or group of individuals." The lawyer, who had just been impatient to speak, now for some reason was silent. His made-up face with its dark blue eyebrows and long hair-lip revealed no particular mental activity. "Leave your cough alone," said Cincinnatus, "and try to concentrate." Roman Vissarionovich jerkily changed the position of his body and clasped his restless fingers. In a plaintive voice he said, "It is exactly for that tone that I am being executed," said Cincinnatus. "I know that. Go on." "Let's change the subject, I implore you," cried Roman Vissarionovich. "Can't you even now remain within legitimate limits? This is really awful. It is beyond my endurance. I dropped in merely to ask if you didn't have some legitimate wishes, for instance." Here his face lit up. "Perhaps you should like to have printed copies of the speeches made at the trial. In case you such desire, you must immediately submit to the necessary petition, which you and I could prepare right now, with detailed specification as to just how many copies of the speeches you require, and for what purpose. I happen to have free hour. Oh, please, let's do this. I have even brought a special envelope, just out of curiosity," said Cincinnatus. "But first, then there really is no chance of getting an answer?" "A special envelope," repeated the lawyer to tempt him. "All right, let's have it," said Cincinnatus, and tore the thick stuffed envelope into crimpy scraps. "You shouldn't have done that," cried the lawyer, on the verge of tears. "You shouldn't have done that at all. You don't even realize what you have done. Perhaps there is a pardon in there. It won't be possible to get another." Cincinnatus picked up a handful of scraps and tried to reconstruct at least one coherent sentence, but everything was mixed up, distorted, disjointed. "This is the sort of thing you always do," whined the lawyer, clutching his temples and placing across the cell. "Perhaps your salvation was right in your very hands, and it's horrible. Well, what shall I do with you? It's lost and gone now. I was so pleased. I was preparing you so carefully." "May I?" said the director in a distended voice as he opened the door ajar. "I shan't disturb you?" "Please come in, Roderick Ivanovich. Please come in," said the lawyer. "Please come in, dear Roderick Ivanovich. Only it is not very cheerful in here." "Well, and how is our doomed friend today?" quipped the elegant, dignified director, compressing in his meaty purple paws the cold little hand of Cincinnatus. "Is everything all right? No aches or pains? Still gossiping with our indefatigable Roman Vissarionovich? Oh, by the way, dear Roman Vissarionovich, I have some good news for you. My little romp just found your cuff link on the stairs. La voici. This is French gold, isn't it? Very, very dainty. I usually do not make compliments, but I must say," they both walked over to a corner, pretending to examine the charming trinket, discussing its history and value, marvel at it. Cincinnatus took this opportunity to take up from under the cot, and with a high purling sound which became hesitant at the end to, "Yes, indeed, in excellent taste, excellent," the director was repeating as he walked back from the corner with the lawyer. "So you are feeling well, young man," he meaningly addressed Cincinnatus, who was climbing back into the bed. "However, you must not be childish. The public, and all of us, as representatives of the public, are interested only in your welfare. That must be obvious by now. We are ready to make things easier for you by relieving your loneliness. In a few days, a new prisoner will be moving into one of our deluxe cells. You will become acquainted, and that will entertain you. In a few days, asked Cincinnatus. Then there will be a few more days? Listen to him, chuckled the director. He has to know everything. How do you like that, Roman Vissarionovitch? Oh, my friend, you are so right, sighed the lawyer. Yes, sir, continued the former, giving his keys a rattle. You ought to be more cooperative, mister. All the time he's haughty, angry, snide. Last night I brought him some of them plums, you know. And what do you think? His Excellency did not choose to eat them. His Excellency was too proud. Yes, sir. I started to tell you about that there was a new printer sooner. You will have your fill of chit-chat with him. No need to mope as you do. Isn't that right, Roman Vissarionovitch? That's right, Rodion. That right, concurred the lawyer with an involuntary smile. Rodion stroked his beard and went on. I've got to feeling very sorry for the poor gentleman. I come in, I look, he's up on the table and chair trying to reach the bars with his little hands and feet, like a sick monkey. And with the sky real blue and the swallows a-flying and the cloudlets a-high, such bliss, such blessings, I take the gentleman down from the table like a baby, and me safe I bawl. Yes, just as I'm standing here, I bawl and I bawl. I really want to all to pieces. I was so sorry for him. We shall take him upstairs. What do you think? The lawyer suggested hesitantly. Why, sure thing, that we can, drawled Rodion with sedate benevolence. We can always do that. Drape yourself in your dressing gown, uttered Roman Vissarionovitch. Cincinnatus said, I obey you, spectres, werewolves, parodies. I obey you. However, I demand, yes, demand. And the other Cincinnatus began to stamp his feet hysterically, losing his slippers, to be told how long I have left to live, and whether I shall be allowed to see my wife. You probably will, replied Roman Vissarionovitch, after exchanging glances with Rodion. Just don't you talk so much. All right, let's go. If you please, said Rodion, giving the unlocked door a shove with his shoulder. All three went out. First Rodion, bow-legged, in old faded breeches, baggy in the seat. Behind him, the lawyer in a frock coat with a smudge on his celluloid collar and an edging of pinkish muslin on the back of his head where the black wig ended. And finally, behind him, Cincinnatus, losing his slippers, wrapping himself more tightly in his dressing gown. At the bend in the corridor, the other nameless guard gave them a salute. The pale stony light alternated with the regions of darkness. They walked and walked. One bend followed another. Several times they passed the very same design of dampness on the wall, looking like some dreadfully ribby horse. Here and there it was necessary to turn on light. A dusty bulb up above or at the side would burst into bitter yellow light. Sometimes also it would be burned out, and then they would shuffle on through the dense darkness. At one spot where an unexpected and inexplicable sunbeam fell from above and glowed mistily as it broke on the eroded flagstones, Emmy, the director's daughter, in a bright checkered frock and checkered socks, a mere child but with the marble caps of a little ballerina, was bouncing a ball rhythmically against the wall. She turned, brushing a blonde lock from her cheek, with the fourth and fifth fingers of a hand, and followed the brief little procession with her eyes. Rodion gave a playful jingle with his keys as he passed. The lawyer lightly stroked her glowing hair, and she was staring at Cincinnatus, who gave her a frightened smile. Upon reaching the next bend of the passage, all three glanced back. Emmy was gazing after them while she lightly plopped the glossy red and blue ball in her hands. Again they walked in darkness for a long time, until they came to a dead end where a ruby bulb shone above a coiled fire-hose. Rodion unlocked a large, low iron door. Beyond it, a stone staircase wound steeply upward. Here the other changed somewhat. Rodion marked time as he let first the lawyer, then Cincinnatus pass, upon which he softly fell in at the end of the procession. It was not easy to climb the steep staircase, whose progress was accompanied by a gradual thinning of the gloom in which it grew, and they climbed for such a long time that out of boredom Cincinnatus began counting the steps, reached a 3-digit number, but then stumbled and lost count. It grew lighter by degrees. Exhausted, Cincinnatus was climbing like a child, beginning with the same foot each time. One more twist, and suddenly there was a solid rush of wind, a dazzling expansion of summer sky, and the air was pierced by the cry of swallows. Our travelers found themselves on a broad terrace at the top of the tower, whence there was a breathtaking view, since not only was the tower huge, but the whole fortress towered hugely on the crest of a huge cliff, of which it seemed to be a monstrous outgrowth. Far below one could see this almost vertical vineyards, and the creamy road that wound down to the dry riverbed. A tiny person in red was crossing the convex bridge. The speck running in front of him was most like a dog. Further away, the sun-flooded town described an ample hemicycle. Some of the vari-colored houses proceeded in even rows, accompanied by round trees, while others are probably kept down slopes. Stepping on their own shadows, one could distinguish the traffic moving on First Boulevard and the Messine shimmer at the end, where the famous and fountain played, and still further toward the hazy folds of the hills that formed the horizon there was the dark stipple of oak groves, with here and there a pond gleaming like a hand-mirror, and the other bright ovals of water gathered, glowing through the tender mist. Over there to the west, there the serpentine's drop had its source. Cincinnatus, his palm pressed through his cheek, its motionless, ineffably vague, and perhaps even blissful despair, gazed at the glimmer and haze of the Tamara gardens and at the dove-blue melting hills beyond them. Oh, it was a long time before he could take his eyes away. A few paces from it, the lawyer leaned his elbows on the broad stone parapet, whose top was overgrown with some kind of enterprising vegetable. His back was soiled with chalk. He peered pensively into space, his left patent leather shoe placed upon his right, and so distending his cheeks with his fingers so that his lower eyelids turned out. Rodion had found a broom somewhere and kept silent as he swept the terrace flagstones. "How bewitching all this is," said Cincinnatus, addressing the gardens, the hills, and for some reason it was especially pleasant to repeat the word bewitching in the wind, somewhat as children cover and then expose their ears, amused at this renewal of the audible word. Bewitching! I have never seen those hills look exactly like that, so mysterious somewhere among their folds, and their mysterious valleys. Couldn't I? No, I had better not think about it. He made a complete tour of the terrace. Flatlands stretched off to the north, with cloud shadows scudding across them, meadows alternated with grain fields. Beyond a bend to the strop one could see weed-blurred outlines of the ancient airport and the structure which they kept, the venerable, decrepit airplane, with motley patches on its rusty wings, which was still sometimes used on holidays, principally and for the amusement of cripples. Matter was weary. Time gently dozed. There was in a town a certain man, a pharmacist, whose great-grandfather, it was said, had left a memoir describing how merchants used to go to China by air. Cincinnatus completed his trip around the terrace and returned to his south parapet. His eyes were making highly illegal excursions. Now he thought he distinguished that very bush and a flower, that bird, that path disappearing under the canopy of ivy. "That will do now," said the director good-naturedly, tossing the broom in a corner and putting on again his frock coat. "Come along home." "Yes, it's time," responded the lawyer, looking at his watch, and the same little procession started back. In front was Director Roderick Ivanovich, behind him the lawyer Roman Vissarionovich, and behind him prisoner Cincinnatus, who after so much fresh air was beset by spasms, yawning. The back of the director's frock coat was soiled with chalk. 4. She came in, taking advantage of Rodion's morning visit, slipping beneath his hands, which were carrying the tray. "Tut, tut, tut," said he, exercising a storm of chocolate. With his soft foot he closed the door behind him, and muttering to his mustache, "What a naughty child." Meanwhile Emmy had hidden from him, squatting behind the table. "Reading a book, eh?" observed Rodion, beaming with kindness. "What a worthwhile pastime." Without raising his eyes from the page, Cincinnatus emitted an iambic assent, but his eyes no longer grasped the text. Rodion finished his uncomplicated duties, traced with the rag the dust dancing a ray of silent sunlight, fed the spider, and left. Emmy was still squatting, but a little less restrained, swaying a little as if on springs, her downy arms crossed, her pink mouth slightly open, and her long, pale, almost white lashes dictating as she looked across the tabletop at the door. An already familiar gesture. Rapidly, with a haphazard selection of fingers, she brushed the flaxen hair from her temple, casting a sidelong glance at Cincinnatus, who had laid aside his books, and was waiting to see what would come next. "He is gone," said Cincinnatus. She left her squatting position, but was still stooping and looking at the door. She was embarrassed and did not know what to undertake. Suddenly she showed her teeth, and with a flash of ballerina cabs, flew to the door, which of course proved to be locked. Her wire sash quickened the air in the cell. Cincinnatus asked her the usual 2 questions. Mincingly she gave her name and answered that she was 12. "And are you sorry for me?" asked Cincinnatus. To this she made no answer. She raised up her face to the clay pitcher, which was standing in the corner. It was empty, hollow-sounding. She hoo-hooted into its depths a few times, and an instant later darted away, and now she was leaning against the wall, supporting herself only with her shoulder blades and elbows, sliding forward on her tensed feet in their flat shoes, and straightening up again. She smiled to herself, and then she continued slithering, glanced at Cincinnatus with a slight scowl as one looks at the low sun. All indications were that this was a wild, restless child. "Aren't you just a little bit sorry for me?" said Cincinnatus. "It isn't possible. I cannot imagine it. Come on over here, you foolish little doe, and tell me on what day shall I die." Emmy, however, made no reply, but slid down to the floor. There she quietly seated herself, pressing her chin against her bent knees, over which she stretched the hem of her skirt. "Tell me, Amy, please. Surely you know all about it. I can tell that you know. Your father has talked at the table. Your mother has talked in the kitchen. Everybody's talking. Yesterday there was a neat little window cut out of the newspaper. That means people are discussing it, and I am the only one." As if caught in a whirlwind, she jumped up from the floor, and flying again to the door, began pounding on it, not with her palms, but rather with the heels of her hands. Her loose, silky blonde hair ended in hanging curls. "If only you were grown up," mused Cincinnatus. "If your soul had a slight touch of the patina, you would, as in poetic antiquity, feed a potion to the turnkey on a night that is murky." "Emmy," he exclaimed, "I implore you, and I shall not desist. Tell me, when shall I die?" Gnawing on a finger, she went over to the table, where the books towered in a pile. She flung one open, leafed through the pages, making them snap and almost ripping them out, banged it shut, picked up another. A rippling something kept running across her face. First she would wrinkle her freckled nose, then her tongue would distend her cheek from within. The door clanged. Rodion, probably having looked through the peephole, came in rather angry. "Shoo, young lady! I'm the one who will catch it for this." She broke into a shrill laughter, dodged his crab-like hand, and rushed to the open door. There, on the threshold, she abruptly stopped with a dancer's magic precision, and perhaps blowing a kiss, or perhaps concluding a pact of silence, looked over her shoulder at Cincinnatus, whereupon, with the same rhythmic suddenness, she was off, running with the long, high, springy steps, already preparing for flight. Rodion, grumbling, jingling, trudging off after her. "Wait a minute," cried Cincinnatus. "I have finished all the books. Bring me again the catalogue." "Books," Rodion scoffed humbly, and looked toward the door behind him, with pronounced resonance. "What anguish! Cincinnatus, what anguish! What stone anguish! Cincinnatus, the merciless bong of the clock, and the obese spider in the yellow walls, and the roughness of the black wool blanket, the skim on the chocolate. Pluck it with 2 fingers at the very center and snatch it whole from the surface, no longer a flat covering, but a wrinkled brown little skirt. The liquid is tepid underneath, sweetish and stagnant. 3 slices of toast with tortoiseshell buns. A round pat of butter embossed with the monogram of the director. What anguish, Cincinnatus! How many crumbs in the bed!" He lamented for a while, groaned, cracked all his joints, then he got up from the cot, put on the abhorred dressing-gown, and began to wander around. Once again he examined the inscriptions on the walls, in the hope that somewhere, discovering a new one, like a fledgling crow on a stump, he stood for a long while in the chair, motionlessly gazing at the beggarly ration of the sky. He walked some more. Once more he had read the 8 rules for inmates, which he already knew by heart. 1. Leaving the prison building is positively forbidden. 2. A prisoner's meekness is a prison's pride. 3. You are firmly requested to maintain quiet between 1 and 3 p.m. daily. 4. You are not allowed to entertain females. 5. Singing, dancing, joking with the guards is permitted only by mutual consent and on certain days. 6. It is desirable that the inmate should not have it all, or if he does, should immediately himself suppress nocturnal dreams whose content might be incompatible with the condition and status of the prisoner, such as resplendent landscapes, outings with friends, family dinners, as well as sexual intercourse with persons who in real life and in the waking state would not suffer said individual to come near, which individual will therefore be considered by the law to be guilty of rape. 7. Inasmuch as he enjoys the hospitality of the prison, the prisoner should in his turn not shirk participation in cleaning and other work of prison personnel in such measure as said participation is offered him. 8. The management shall in no case be responsible for the loss of property or in the inmate himself. Anguish, anguish, Cincinnatus. Pace some more, Cincinnatus, brushing with your robe first the walls, then the chair. Anguish, the books heaped on the table have all been read. And even though he knew that they had all been read, Cincinnatus searched, rummaged, and peeked into a thick volume. Without sitting down, he leafed through the already familiar pages. It was a bound magazine, published once upon a time in a barely remembered age. The prison library, considered the second city for its size and the rarity of its volumes, kept several such curiosities. So that was a remote world where the simplest objects sparkled with youth and inborn insolence, proceeding from the reverence that surrounded the laborer devoted to their manufacture. Those were years of universal fluidity. Well-oiled metals performed silent, soundless acrobatics, and harmonious lines of men's suits were dictated by the unheard-of limberness of muscular bodies, and flowing glass of enormous windows curved around corners of buildings. A girl in a bathing suit flew like a swallow so high over a pool that it seemed no larger than a saucer. A high jumper lay supine in the air, having already made such extreme effort that if it were not for the flag-like folds of his shorts, he would seem to be in the lazy repose. And water ran, glided endlessly, the gracefulness of falling water, the dazzling details of bathrooms, the satiny ripples of the ocean with two-winged shadow falling upon it. Everything was lustrous and shimmering, everything gravitated passionately toward a kind of perfection, whose definition was absence of friction, reveling in all the temptations of circle, life, whirled to a state of such giddiness that the ground fell away, and stumbling, falling, weakened by nausea and languor. Ought I to say it, finding itself in a new dimension, as it were? Yes, matter has grown old and weary, and little has survived of those legendary days. A couple of machines, 2 or 3 fountains, and no one regrets the past, and even the very concept of the past has changed. But then, perhaps, thought Cincinnatus, I am misinterpreting these pictures, attributing to the epoch of the characteristics of a photograph. The wealth of shadows, the torrents of light, the gloss of a tanned shoulder, the rare reflection, the fluid transitions from one element to another, perhaps all of this pertains only to the snapshot, to a particular kind of heliotopy, to special forms of the art. And the world never was so sinuous, so humid and rapid, just as today our unsophisticated cameras record in their own way our hastily assembled and painted world. But then, perhaps, Cincinnatus began to write rapidly on a sheet of ruled paper, I am misinterpreting, attributing to the epoch this wealth, torrents, fluid transitions, and the world never really has, just as, but how can these ruminations help my anguish? Oh, my anguish, what shall I do with you, myself? How dare they conceal from me, I who must pass through an ordeal of supreme pain, I who, in order to preserve a semblance of dignity, always I shall not go beyond silent pallor. I am no hero anyway, must during that ordeal keep control of all my faculties. I am gradually weakening. The uncertainty is horrible. Well, why don't you tell me? Do tell me. But no, you have me die anew every morning. On the other hand, were I to know, I could perform a short work, a record of verified thoughts. Some day someone would read it, and would suddenly feel just as if he had awakened for the first time in a strange country. What I mean to say is that I would make him suddenly burst into tears of joy, his eyes would melt, and after he experiences this, the world will seem to him clearer, fresher. But how can I begin writing when I do not know whether I shall have time enough, and the torture comes when you say to yourself, yesterday there would have been enough time, and again you think, if only I had begun yesterday, and instead of the clear and precise work that is needed, instead of a gradual preparation of the soul for that morning when it will have to get up, when you, soul, will be offered the executioner's pail to wash in. Instead, you involuntarily indulge in banal, senseless dreams of escape. Alas, of escape! Today, when she came running in, stamping and laughing, that is, no, I still ought to record, to leave something. I am not an ordinary. I am the one among you who is alive. Not only are my eyes different, and my hearing, and my sense of taste, not only is my sense of smell like a deer's, my sense of touch like a bat's, but most important, I have the capacity to conjoin all of this in one point. No, the secret is not revealed yet. Even this is but the flint. I have not even begun to speak of the kindling, of the fire itself. My life, once when I was a child, on a distant school excursion, when I got separated from the others, although I may have dreamt it, I found myself under the sultry sun of midday in a drowsy little town, so drowsy that when a man who had been dozing on a bench beneath a bright whitewashed wall at last got up to help me find my way, his blue shadow on the wall did not immediately follow him. Oh, I know. There must have been some oversight on my part, and the shadow did not linger at all, but simply, shall we say, it caught on the wall's unevenness. But here is what I want to express between his movement and the movement of the laggard shadow, that syncope. There is the rare kind of time in which I live, the pause, the hiatus, when the heart is like a feather, and I would write also about the continual tremor, and about how part of my thoughts is always crowding around the invisible umbilical cord that joins this world to something, to what I shall not say yet. But how can I write about this when I am afraid of not having time to finish, and of stirring up all these thoughts in vain? When she came rushing in today, only a child, here's what I want to say, only a child with certain loopholes for my thoughts. I wondered, to the rhythm of an ancient poem, could she not give the guards a drugged potion? Could she not rescue me? If only she would remain the child she is, but at the same time mature and understand, and that it would be feasible. Her burning cheeks, a black windy night. Salvation, salvation. I'm wrong when I keep repeating that there is no refuge in the world for me. There is. I'll find it, a lush ravine in the desert, a patch of snow in the shadow of an alpine crag. This is unhealthy, though. What am I doing? As it is, I am weak, and here I am exciting myself, squandering the last of my strength. What anguish, oh, what anguish! And it is obvious to me that I have not yet removed the final film from my fear. He became lost in thought. Then he dropped the pencil, got up, began walking. The striking of the clock reached his ears, using its chimes as a platform. Footfalls rose to the surface, the platform floated away, the footfalls remained. And now 2 persons entered the cell, Rodion with the soup and the librarian with the catalogue. The latter was a man with tremendous size, with sickly appearance, pale with shadows under his eyes, with a bald spot encircled by a dark crown of hair, with a long torso and a blue sweater, faded in places, with indigo patches on the elbows. He had his hands in the pockets of his pants, which he narrowed stiff, and clutched under his arm a large book, bound in black leather. Cincinnatus had already once had the pleasure of seeing him. The catalogue, said the librarian, whose speech was distinguished by a kind of defiant laconicism. Fine, leave it there, said Cincinnatus. I shall choose something. If you would like to wait to sit down for a minute, please do. If, however, you should like to go, said the librarian. All right, then I shall return the catalogue through Rodion. Here, you may take these back with you. These magazines of the ancients are wonderfully moving. With this weighty volume I went down, as with a ballast to the bottom of time, an enchanting sensation. No, said the librarian. Bring me some more. I'll copy out the years I want. And some novel, a recent one. You are going out already? You have everything? Left alone, Cincinnatus went to work on the soup, simultaneously leafing through the catalogue. Its nucleus was carefully and attractively printed. Amid the printed text, numerous titles were inserted in red ink, and a small but precise hand. It was difficult for someone who was not a specialist to make sense of the catalogue, since the titles were arranged not in alphabetical order, but according to the number of pages in each, with notations as to how many extra sheets, in order to avoid duplication, had been pasted into this or that book. Therefore Cincinnatus searched without any definite goal in mind, picking out whatever happened to seem attractive. The catalogue was kept in a state of exemplary cleanness. This made it all the more surprising that on the white verso of one of the first pages a child's hand had made a series of pencil drawings, whose meaning at first escaped Cincinnatus.